In 1979, Ridley Scott gave audiences a single creature stalking a handful of terrified crew members through the tightest corridors imaginable, and it worked because there was nowhere to run. 7 years later, James Cameron looked at that formula and decided the only way to top it was to blow it wide open. Instead of one monster in the dark, he gave us a colonized moon, a squad of overconfident space marines, and a queen the size of a school bus. Fox released Aliens in the summer of 1986, and it didn't just match the original. It redefined what a sequel could be. Sigourney Weaver returned as Ellis Ripley, the lone survivor who knows exactly how this story ends if nobody listens to her. Michael Biehn played Hicks, the corporal who somehow keeps his head when everyone around him is losing theirs. Bill Paxton stole scene after scene as Hudson, the Marine with the biggest mouth on the ship and the shortest fuse once things go wrong. Jeanette Goldstein brought raw physicality to Vasquez. Paul Reiser oozed corporate menace as Burke, and Lance Henriksen made Bishop the synthetic nobody could quite decide whether to trust. Behind the scenes, though, this production was chaos. Union revolts, gunfire through the wrong soundstage wall, a composer given 4 days to do 6 weeks of work, and a legal fight, so strange it may be the actual reason this movie exists at all. Here are 15 things about Aliens that even longtime fans tend to miss, counting down to a detail buried in the sound design that's been sitting there, unnoticed, for 4 decades. Before she became one of the toughest Marines ever put on film, Jeanette Goldstein had no idea what she was actually auditioning for. She'd heard James Cameron was casting a project called Aliens and assumed, reasonably enough, that it was some kind of drama about immigration. So she showed up dressed for the part she imagined, heels, a short skirt, nothing remotely close to a combat uniform. Cameron cast her anyway, because underneath the wrong outfit was exactly the physical presence he needed for a hardened colonial Marine. The story didn't stop there. Once the writers caught wind of how spectacularly she'd misread the casting call, they folded her mistake directly into the script. Vasquez's line about signing up because she thought someone said, "illegal aliens," wasn't an accident of dialogue. It was Goldstein's own confusion, immortalized on screen. Turning her into Vasquez required roughly an hour in the makeup chair every single day. Contact lenses, darkened skin, and an accent built from the ground up. Cameron has acknowledged in later interviews that the casting choices around that character would likely play very differently today. Whatever the discomfort of hindsight, the performance held up, and Goldstein went on to become a regular in Cameron's world, later appearing in both Terminator 2 and Titanic, all traced back to an actress who wandered into the wrong room in the wrong clothes. According to producer Gale and Hurd, Cameron had exactly one actor in mind for Hudson from the very beginning, Bill Paxton, a friend of his going back to their days working under Roger Corman on low-budget productions. The problem was that the studio had never heard of him. Paxton's most recognizable credit at that point was a supporting role as the obnoxious older brother in Weird Science, hardly the resume of a battle-hardened Marine, so an audition was still required. He read for Cameron at Pinewood Studios while in London visiting his girlfriend, walked out of the room convinced he'd overacted the whole thing, and flew home expecting nothing. Then Weird Science hit theaters, and the reviews started coming in stronger than anyone expected. Cameron pushed his name again, this time with the studio's head of casting recognizing exactly which notices he meant, and the decision was locked in almost overnight. Paxton's own worry, though, had nothing to do with getting cast. It was about what audiences would think once they saw him. He assumed viewers would spend the entire back half of the film simply waiting for Hudson to die, since the character talks the biggest game in the room and falls apart the fastest once the bullets start flying. In hindsight, he had it backwards. Hudson's meltdown became the release valve for the whole audience, saying out loud what everyone watching already felt. Paxton later put it simply, "For every confident Ripley or steady Hicks, there are 100 Hudsons." Before Michael Biehn ever set foot on the Alien set, the role of Corporal Hicks belonged to James Remar. Director Walter Hill, who'd worked with Remar before, helped him land the audition, and Remar arrived at Pinewood fully committed. He even hand-painted his own chest armor with the heart and a padlock design. Then things went sideways fast. During filming, Remar somehow discharged a weapon loaded with live ammunition, sending a round through a soundstage wall and into the set next door, which happened to belong to Little Shop of Horrors. Nobody was injured, but it rattled the production. That incident alone wasn't what ended his time on the film, though. Roughly 2 weeks into filming, Remar was arrested in London on drug-related charges, something he has discussed candidly in interviews since. The official explanation given at the time was creative differences, but the real situation was serious enough that producers reportedly pushed to have him deported rather than let the matter play out in a British courtroom. A move that, according to Heard, likely spared him a lengthy prison sentence. The fallout extended beyond the film itself. Walter Hill, the director who'd vouched for him, didn't work with Remar again for over a decade. Michael Biehn, meanwhile, got a phone call on a Friday night asking only whether his passport was current. He said yes, flew to London, and was on set by Monday with no rehearsal time. He even inherited Remar's original armor design and reportedly hated it, joking that the heart and padlock motif made him look like he had a target painted on his chest. Strangely, Remar never fully disappeared from the finished film. There's a wide shot inside the alien nest showing a figure from behind, and that figure is Remar, filmed weeks before his exit. For the sequence where Ripley tears the young girl nude out of the alien nest with her bare hands, Cameron had a wall of prop glass built for Weaver to smash through. Glass, he assured her, was completely harmless. Weaver wasn't convinced. She ran her hand across it before filming and told Cameron it felt sharper than he seemed to think. To prove his point, Cameron grabbed the nest material himself and tore through it barehanded without a scratch. Reassured, Weaver performed the scene exactly as scripted, running in, pulling nude free, and running back out. It was only afterward that she looked down and realized her hands were bleeding. Her own explanation for the discrepancy was simply that she wasn't as tough as her director. She tells the story with genuine warmth, which fits, since she and Cameron have continued working together for decades, all the way through the Avatar films. The lesson she says she took from it has stuck with her ever since. Whenever a director insists something is perfectly safe, assume the opposite. The exosuit Ripley straps into for a final showdown with the alien queen very nearly looked completely different. Cameron's original concept had the cargo loader walking on 4 legs, and that version actually made it as far as the film's novelization before it was scrapped entirely. The reason was Star Wars. The Empire Strikes Back had introduced audiences to the 4-legged AT-AT walkers back in 1980, and Cameron refused to risk any comparison. So he abandoned the design and started over with a bipedal machine instead. For the new look, he brought in visual futurist Sid Mead, known for his work on Blade Runner and Tron, only to realize that some of Mead's earlier industrial walking machine concept art had actually helped inspire the AT-ATS in the first place. In the end, the design that made it to screen was largely Cameron's own. Building a working version was brutal. The first prototype was little more than pipes and foam assembled in a single day, mostly to prove to a skeptical English crew that Cameron genuinely intended to make them build this thing. The finished rig weighed around 600 pounds and was so front-heavy that it kept toppling forward during rehearsals. No one could actually wear it and operate it convincingly, so stuntman John Lees ended up riding inside it, hidden directly behind Weaver, working the legs while she rode on top, giving it a human face. Cameron later compared the effect to the old trick of a father letting his child stand on his feet while he walks. The man responsible for designing the most influential movie monster of all time had no involvement whatsoever in its sequel. H.R. Giger wasn't approached, wasn't consulted, and by his own account learned that Aliens was already in production only after filming had begun in England. At the time, he was in Los Angeles working on Poltergeist 2. He later said the sting of being left out was real. A second Alien was a project he would have jumped at, and when he asked around, nobody would give him a straight answer. His personal theory was that the Poltergeist production kept him in the dark deliberately, worried about losing him to the bigger movie. Cameron's own explanation was more direct. In an apologetic letter sent to Giger's agent, he admitted he simply wanted more creative control over the sequel's monster design than working with Giger again would have allowed. Producer accounts point to scheduling conflicts tied to Giger's Poltergeist 2 contract, though Cameron later conceded that a way around it could likely have been found if the production had pushed harder. Giger was compensated for the continued use of his original design, just not brought on to help evolve it. The job instead went to Stan Winston, fresh off collaborating with Cameron on The Terminator. Winston's warrior alien stayed faithful to Geiger's original nightmare, with only minor adjustments, while the film's one genuinely new creature, the Queen, was Cameron's own design from the ground up. Winston's team built just 12 alien suits total, and used clever staging to make it look like an entire swarm. When Geiger eventually saw the finished film, he reportedly loved what had been done with the Queen, even if he never stopped wishing someone had picked up the phone. Aliens came closer to collapsing over tea than over anything involving the monster itself. Nearly the entire film was shot at Pinewood Studios with a fully unionized British crew, and that crew had little patience for a 31-year-old American director with no experience navigating how a British set operated. They'd loved working with Ridley Scott on the original film, and here was an unfamiliar filmmaker they nicknamed the Yank, giving orders alongside his producer, whom several crew members resented working under as well. The single biggest flashpoint was the twice-daily tea break, locked into the schedule at 10 and 2 o'clock sharp. Gale and Hurd later described the crew as clock watchers, who vanished the instant the tea trolley appeared, regardless of what was happening on set. On one occasion, Cameron spent nearly an hour filling a soundstage with atmospheric smoke for a shot, only to watch the crew swing open the massive stage doors to let the tea cart through, sending the entire effect drifting outside before a single frame could be captured. The real breaking point came with first assistant director Derek Cracknell, who repeatedly overrode Cameron's camera setups and rebuilt shots his own way, sometimes forcing entire sets to be torn down and redone. Cameron eventually fired him, and Cracknell responded by convincing the crew to down tools and walk off mid-shoot without warning, halting production entirely. Around this time, crew members started wearing t-shirts reading, "You can't scare me. I work for James Cameron." It was Sigourney Weaver, trusted by both sides, who ultimately negotiated peace. Cracknell agreed to fall back in line, and Cameron agreed to stop treating the tea breaks as sabotage. By the film's wrap, Weaver has said, the crew had genuinely come around to him. Composer James Horner arrived in London expecting a finished cut of the film and roughly 6 weeks to score it. Instead, he found a movie still being assembled, and a director locked away obsessing over pulse rifle sound effects with barely any usable footage to hand over. Horner pushed for more time. Cameron and Hurd refused to move the release schedule, and when Horner kept pressing, Hurd reportedly threatened to bring in a replacement composer. Horner's response was simply to invite her to find anyone else physically capable of meeting that deadline. Nobody could, so Horner wrote almost the entire score in about 4 days before heading into Abbey Road Studios to record it with the London Symphony Orchestra. The film's climactic cue, often referred to as Bishop's Countdown, along with the music underscoring Ripley's final confrontation with the Queen, was reportedly composed overnight. Then Cameron recut the film's ending after the fact, forcing Horner into roughly 36 hours of frantic rewrites to match the new footage, with some scenes stitched together from as many as 4 separate musical cues. Bishop's Countdown was the one major piece that survived the process intact, and it went on to become one of the most reused pieces of trailer music in Hollywood history, appearing in dozens of unrelated film trailers over the following decades. The rushed, exhausting job still earned Horner his first Oscar nomination. The tension between him and Cameron lingered for roughly 11 years, until Horner was reportedly won back onto Cameron's Titanic after his score for Braveheart re-established his standing in the industry. The original Alien cost somewhere between $9 and $11 million to make, and pulled in well over $100 million at the box office, a hit by any reasonable measure. Fox's accountants, however, told a very different story, initially claiming the film had actually lost the studio around $2 million. When industry analysts began publicly picking apart those numbers, Fox revised its position and suddenly discovered a $4 million profit instead. Brandywine Productions, the company that had actually produced the film, didn't buy either figure and sued over the unpaid earnings. The legal fight dragged on for roughly 3 years before finally settling in 1983. And the terms of that settlement were the strange part. Fox agreed to put a sequel into development, not because the studio had suddenly developed enthusiasm for the project, but because letting Brandywine profit from a new film was cheaper than paying out what it already owed from the first one. Reportedly, almost nobody at the studio actually wanted to make it. Producer David Giler has pointed to an incoming Fox executive Norman Levy, as someone who believed a sequel would flop outright. Giler has also described running into the studio owner's son at a bar and asking when his father would finally greenlight the film, only to be told the answer was essentially never, since avoiding the project was projected to save the studio millions, which makes the eventual result almost absurd. One of the most acclaimed sequels ever made, one that earned Sigourney Weaver an Oscar nomination, exists primarily because a studio got legally cornered and decided a movie was the cheapest way out of a bill. Depending on the specific shot, bringing the alien queen to life required anywhere from 8 to 16 people working together. Standing roughly 14 feet tall, she was a fully physical creation built by Stan Winston's team, with no digital assistance available in 1986. 2 stunt performers were sealed inside her torso, each controlling one large outer arm and one smaller inner arm, giving her all 4 limbs at once. Her head was too far away for anyone inside the suit to reach, so it operated on an entirely separate hydraulic system, with control lines running out to a support rig where technicians physically turned steering wheels to swing her head around. Her face required yet another team, with her jaw, teeth, and lips all controlled independently by cables. None of that existed at the very start of the process. The first test version was a rough assembly of foam and garbage bags mounted on a crane rig, built purely to answer one question. Could 2 people successfully operate a giant hanging puppet in a way that would actually read as convincing on camera? When Cameron first described his plan to physically hide performers inside a creature of that size, Winston's reaction, by his own account, was that Cameron had clearly lost his mind, followed almost immediately by the realization that if Cameron could picture it clearly enough, it was probably buildable. It was, and the finished queen became one of the largest and most technically ambitious practical creatures ever put on film. Same actress, same role, 3 films, roughly 13 years apart, and a paycheck that grew by more than 100 times over that span. Every version of Cameron's script kept Ripley at the center of the story, but Fox saw a budget problem. By the time Aliens was in development, Weaver had become a genuine star thanks to both Alien and Ghostbusters, and the studio grew nervous enough about her asking price that executives floated the idea of making the sequel without her entirely, instructing Cameron to write Ripley out of the film. Cameron refused outright, and for a period, neither side budged. Fox eventually blinked. Weaver signed for a reported $1 million plus a share of the profits, roughly 30 times what she'd been paid to originate the role in the first film, and a landmark deal for an actress at that point in Hollywood history. Her performance then did something the science fiction genre had almost never managed. It earned her a Best Actress Oscar nomination, a category action and sci-fi leads simply didn't crack at the time. It would be roughly 3 decades before another performance in the genre achieved the same recognition. Her price kept climbing from there. When Weaver expressed reluctance about returning for Alien 3, the studio reportedly offered her around $4 million, along with a co-producer credit, to secure her involvement, for a film that ultimately kills Ripley off for good. 2 lines from this film get quoted constantly: Ripley's confrontation with the Queen, and Hudson's panic declaration that it's game over, man. The natural assumption is that both erupted spontaneously in the heat of filming, the kind of moment that only lands because the actor genuinely meant it. That assumption turns out to be correct exactly once, and it's not the line most people would guess. Ripley's line was written into the script from day one, word for word, with no improvisation involved. What nobody planned for was the production schedule. By the time the crew reached that sequence, time was so tight that Weaver had to be rigged directly into the power loader, with an operator crammed in behind her, doors forced open, and the entire confrontation captured in a single take. Her voice cracked upward mid-line, and she was convinced she'd ruined the shot. She asked to do it again, and was told there simply wasn't time. That imperfect, adrenaline-driven take is the one that made the final cut and became iconic. Hudson's line went the opposite direction. Cameron never wrote it. Paxton has said plainly that he was never comfortable improvising with the camera actually rolling, so his real method was floating ideas during rehearsals and trusting Cameron's memory to pull the good ones back out weeks later during filming. That's reportedly how the line, "Express elevator to hell, going down," ended up in the movie as well. For Hudson specifically, Paxton had built out an entire mental backstory of a character raised on arcade games, where game over was simply what flashed on screen once your last quarter ran out. He tossed the line out during rehearsal with no idea it would end up outliving nearly everything else his character said. Most film fans have heard some version of this story. Cameron walks into a room full of studio executives, writes alien on a whiteboard, adds an S, then draws two lines through the S to turn it into a $sign, and walks out with a green light. The $sign detail is real, and Cameron has confirmed it himself more than once. The legend, though, cleaned up a few of the actual details. He wasn't standing at a whiteboard performing for a room of strangers. He was sitting with 3 producers in the office of Fox's studio head, and he scrawled the pitch on the blank back page of his own script. By the time he got around to drawing the $sign, he'd already delivered the substance of his pitch. The original film was one creature stalking a handful of people, and his sequel would be aliens, plural, Ripley against an entire army. The $sign was simply the closing punchline. According to Cameron, the room went with the title on the spot and never questioned it again. What makes the moment land even better in context is that Cameron had reportedly been talked out of the whole project beforehand. A senior producer warned him over lunch that directing this sequel was a no-win situation. Succeed, and Ridley Scott gets the credit for the original vision. Fail, and it ends his career. Cameron's reported answer amounted to, essentially, that he liked the idea anyway. This was coming from a filmmaker with exactly one real hit to his name at the time, betting on a sequel that plenty of people at the studio actively didn't want made. Even after the pitch landed, the project still had to grind through the usual studio approval process, and it was ultimately Cameron's growing reputation off The Terminator that secured him the director's chair on an $18.5 million production. Stephen Lang auditioned for Aliens and didn't get the part. More than 2 decades later, the same director handed him the lead villain role in the highest-grossing film ever made. The first time around, Lang read for Corporal Hicks and lost the role to James Remar, the very same Remar who would later be fired from the production only weeks into filming. At that point, Lang was a respected New York stage actor with no science fiction credits to his name, just one more actor on a long casting list for a mid-budget sequel shooting at Pinewood. By all accounts,